David Harper never belonged in a ballroom. He was a single dad who spent most of his days fixing cars at a neighborhood garage, and his nights helping his daughter with math homework at the kitchen table. The fanciest thing he owned was a navy blue suit he bought secondhand, still too big in the shoulders, but clean and pressed for special moments. So when an unexpected invitation to a black-tie charity gala arrived courtesy of the scholarship fund that helped send his daughter to a prestigious school, David saw it not as a chance to impress, but as a way to say thank you. What he didn't expect was the stares, the judgment, the smug smiles of wealthier guests who assumed he was someone's driver or a last-minute caterer. He kept his head down, holding on to the thought of his daughter, Lily, and the pride in her eyes when she saw him leave that night. But then, everything changed. Elena Sinclair, the billionaire hostess with a reputation for elegance and steel, noticed him, not for what he lacked, but for the quiet strength he carried. And by the end of the night, after whispers, mockery, and one unforgettable bid, David would no longer be the man the room overlooked. He would be the man they'd never forget. David Harper had never expected his name to be on the guest list of anything remotely resembling a charity gala. His world revolved around socket wrenches and oil stains, not silk ties and ballroom chandeliers. Most days, he came home smelling like grease and gasoline, exhausted but content to hear his daughter, Lily, chatter about school over a simple dinner. So when a letter arrived in the mail bearing the emblem of the Sinclair Foundation, thick cream-colored paper, elegant black print, thought it was a mistake. The invitation was addressed to him, not as an add-on to someone else's experience, but as a guest of honor for parents of scholarship recipients. Lily had earned one of those scholarships, securing her place in one of the best private schools in the state. And now, apparently, that came with an invite to a glittering gala he could hardly afford to think about. At first, he considered not going. He didn't have the money for a tux, much less the confidence to walk into a room full of millionaires. But Lily insisted. She was only 11, but wise beyond her years, always sensing when her father was trying to shrink himself out of the picture. "You deserve to be there, Dad," she'd said, sliding the invitation across the table with a proud grin. "They should see the reason why I work so hard." He'd smiled, tried to brush it off, but the words stayed with him through the week. So he borrowed a suit from an old friend, one size too big and a decade out of style, and shined his scuffed shoes until they nearly reflected light again. On the night of the gala, he drove himself in his 15-year-old pickup truck, parking 2 blocks away so it wouldn't draw attention. The Grand Hotel was lit up like something out of a dream, its marble steps glistening under warm lights, and the hum of luxury sedans dropping off their polished passengers. David stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking a breath that smells faintly of city rain and cologne he'd borrowed from a neighbor. His fingers fidgeted with the cuffs of his shirts lightly frayed but clean. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there because of Lily. Because she had earned every bit of her future, and he wanted to show up for her, even if it meant standing in a room where he was bound to be out of place. He stepped inside, heart steady, shoulders squared the best he could manage, unaware that by the end of the evening, his name would echo far beyond the walls of that ballroom. The moment David crossed the threshold into the ballroom, it was clear he had entered a different world. Everything gleamed: polished floors, cascading crystal chandeliers, waiters gliding through the crowd with trays of champagne. The air buzzed with laughter that was just a little too sharp, conversations wrapped in layers of pretense and familiarity. Guests floated from group to group like they'd all rehearsed this dance 1,000 times. And there was David, calloused hands at his sides, taking in the extravagance like a tourist stepping off a bus in a foreign city. He smiled politely at the first couple he passed, offering a quiet nod. They looked him up and down and continued walking, no greeting returned. Another group of men near the bar glanced his way, chuckling under their breath as one of them leaned in to whisper something, his eyes never leaving David. It wasn't hard to guess the tone of their words. David didn't shrink. He simply walked toward the nameplate cards on the table to find his seat, willing his steps to remain measured, unbothered. But the sense of otherness pressed in like a weight he hadn't been prepared for. At his table, he recognized no one, though he tried to introduce himself. "David Harper. My daughter, Lily, is on the Sinclair Scholarship," he said with a steady voice and a small smile. A woman in a sequined gown barely turned her head. "Oh," she said, her lips pursing slightly. "How nice." Another man offered a quick nod before turning back to his phone. Their body language said everything. They didn't consider him part of their circle, didn't think his story belonged in their evening. David sat anyway, resting his hands on the linen-covered table, determined not to let discomfort chase him out. He thought of Lily again, of the bright smile she gave him when he left the house. He imagined her saying, "Just be yourself, Dad. That's more than enough." He watched the room from the corner of his eye, trying to find something familiar. The gala was meant to celebrate the generosity of donors and the promise of bright futures, but it was hard not to feel like he was just a placeholder in someone else's performance. There were parents here too, he knew, but they blended into the crowd with tailored suits and high-end dresses. No one else looked like him, like they'd had to choose between groceries or gas that week, like they'd patched up a frayed jacket instead of buying new. Still, he stayed. He belonged to this moment because his daughter had earned it, and no sideways glance or whispered remark would take that from him. He had spent years working in the shadows, giving her every tool to reach for the light. Tonight, he would sit in the brightness, no matter how blinding it felt. It didn't take long before David realized he had become the subject of idle entertainment for some of the guests. The sneers weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. It started subtly, a quick up and down glance, the kind that judged him before his name had even left his lips. Then came the smiles, polite but too tight around the edges, accompanied by eyes that didn't bother to linger. A man in a designer tux whispered something behind a gloved hand, prompting a woman beside him to chuckle and give David a glance so brief it may as well have dismissed his entire existence. He tried to ignore it, choosing instead to sip slowly from the glass of water in front of him. No wine tonight. He needed his head clear. At one point, a sharply dressed woman leaned toward him across the table, her tones sweet but laced with mockery. "So, Mr. Harper, you're one of the mechanics who helps keep the donor vehicles running?" Her eyes gleamed, amused with her own assumption. David's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his voice even. "Actually, I'm here because my daughter's on a full scholarship. Lily Harper, 6th grade. She's top of her class." That wiped the smile clean off her face, and for a second, she looked genuinely surprised. But it only lasted a heartbeat before her expression snapped back into a polite mask. "How impressive," she murmured, then turned away before he could respond. The laughter from a nearby table grew louder, and David could feel the heat rise in his neck. He wasn't naive. He knew this room was designed for people with names engraved on plaques and accounts that never dipped. He knew he didn't belong to the world of gala auctions and custom tuxedos. Still, the cruelty stung more than he'd expected. Not because he was ashamed of who he was, but because these people didn't care to know. They weren't interested in the years he'd spent waking up before sunrise to open the shop. They didn't see the way he'd taught Lily fractions by using bolts and washers from his toolbox, or how he never missed a single parent-teacher meeting, even if it meant closing early and losing pay. To them, he was a story they thought they already knew, a man who had wandered into the wrong room and stayed too long. But David wasn't going to walk out. He could take the sneers. He had taken worse for less important reasons. This wasn't about pride. It was about presence. He was there for Lily, and that meant holding his ground, even as the ground beneath him shifted with every sideways glance. They didn't have to respect him. He hadn't come for them. He had come to honor the chance his daughter had earned. And no smirk, no half-hearted compliment would make him forget that. David didn't carry power in his wallet, nor prestige in his name, but he had something else, grace. The kind that doesn't seek applause or demand attention, but steadies a man when the world tries to shake him. He leaned into that quiet strength as the evening dragged on, choosing to listen more than he spoke. Where others boasted about their investments or name-dropped socialites like currency, David spoke only when spoken to, and when he did, his words were grounded in sincerity. That was something no one could mimic. It came from a life lived close to the bone, where kindness and effort mattered more than polish. He watched the speakers take the stage, smiling through their rehearsed gratitude and heartfelt stories of impact. The applause came on cue, the laughter well-timed, the nods almost too synchronized. Yet none of it felt false, just distant, like watching a play unfold from backstage. David clapped too, respectfully, but his thoughts were on Lily. He pictured her curled up with a book, probably rereading the same fantasy novel for the fourth time, underlining her favorite lines. She had asked him earlier, "Do you think they'll treat you nice, Daddy?" He had told her not to worry. He had lied, just a little. But now, instead of resentment, he let that memory be his anchor. When a server passed by offering hors d'oeuvre with names he couldn't pronounce, David politely declined. He didn't need to pretend. He wasn't ashamed of who he was, or where he came from. If anything, he was proud. He had raised Lily on his own since she was 3. No shortcuts, no favors, just long days and longer nights. And through it all, he had never once asked the world to bend for him. He had only asked for a chance for her. That's why he kept his head high, even when laughter sounded a bit too pointed, or when conversations shifted the moment he stepped into their orbit. He gave people the benefit of the doubt, even if they hadn't earned it. That was his way. His father had taught him that dignity wasn't something you wore, it was something you carried. And David carried it like armor, quiet, heavy, and worn from years of use. In the midst of all the excess, the champagne towers, the designer gowns, the curated playlists, David's presence was a quiet kind of defiance. He didn't belong, not by their standards, but he didn't need to. He had shown up, with clean hands, a steady gaze, and a heart full of purpose. And while no one seemed to notice now, someone would. Eventually, someone would see past the second-hand suit, past the calloused hands, and understand what real grace looked like. It wasn't the sound of her heels or the flash of her dress that turned heads. Elena Sinclair didn't need to announce her presence. Her entrance was quiet, yet it rippled through the room like the subtle shift of wind before a storm. She moved with an elegance that didn't ask for attention, it commanded it. Tall, poised, and dressed in a deep emerald gown that hugged her like confidence itself, Elena was the kind of woman who made people straighten their backs and lower their voices. She didn't smile for effect. She didn't perform. She simply was. David noticed her the same way everyone else did gradually. Then, all at once, she had entered near the far column, speaking briefly with the head of the foundation before gliding toward the center of the room. There was no fanfare, no announcement, but the guests instinctively parted for her, like she carried gravity. Some leaned in to greet her, their hands eager, voices light with praise. Elena returned each exchange with the kind of practiced warmth that made people feel seen but never truly close. She was polite, gracious even, but unmistakably above the fray. And yet, as she passed by David's table, something shifted. Her eyes, the color of dark honey, swept the room with ease, but when they landed on him, they paused, just for a second, a fraction longer than they stayed on anyone else. It wasn't the gaze of curiosity or judgment. It was interesting, plain, and open. She didn't look away quickly, as others had. She met his eyes, let the moment sit, then offered him a small nod, not forced, not performative, genuine. David nodded back, unsure if he imagined the whole thing. But something about her expression told him he hadn't. The people at his table noticed it too. One woman tilted her head slightly, glancing between Elena and David with a flicker of confusion. Another man's smile faded for a beat, his posture stiffening as if the rules had suddenly changed. After all, Elena Sinclair wasn't known for making random gestures. She was the architect of the evening, the billionaire behind the Sinclair Foundation, and her time was reserved for those whose wealth or influence earned it. That she had paused even for a second was enough to upset the order of things. David didn't dwell on it. He returned to his water, hands still, expression calm. But inside, something stirred. Not because he believed the moment meant anything beyond courtesy, but because it reminded him that kindness could still live in unlikely places. Even here, in a room built on status and surface, someone like Elena Sinclair could choose to look deeper, and that, no matter how fleeting, felt like a small act of grace. As the evening unfolded, Elena moved through the ballroom like a conductor guiding a silent orchestra. Conversations quieted slightly when she passed, the sound of her laughter warm, never forced, acting like a cue for others to relax. She spoke to CEOs, thanked donors, made gentle jokes that everyone laughed at, just enough to show they were in on the moment. Yet, even amid the swirl of attention, her gaze drifted again to the edge of the room, where David now stood near the tall windows, half shielded by the velvet curtain. He wasn't hiding, exactly, just catching a breath. He had stepped away from the table when the auctioneer took the stage, giving himself a moment to breathe without an audience. The buzz of voices, the rustle of paper programs, and the rhythm of whispered judgments had grown heavier as the evening wore on. So he found the edge of the room, leaned lightly against the frame, and looked out at the night sky. City lights sparkled beyond the glass, distant and indifferent. And for a while, David simply watched them, content in the quiet. That's when he felt it, that flicker of awareness, the sense that someone was watching him. He turned, slowly. Across the room, Elena was smiling. Not a grand smile, not a stage-ready grin, just something quiet, real. It was the kind of smile that told him she saw him not as a curiosity or a charity case, but as a man standing on his own 2 feet. For the first time all evening, David's shoulders eased just a little. He gave her a nod, subtle and respectful, not expecting anything in return. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then moved on, slipping back into the tide of guests. But the moment lingered like warmth on skin after sunlight passes. Back at the table, David didn't mention it. The others had clearly noticed, but no one spoke. One woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair. A man offered him a tight-lipped smirk, as if waiting for David to make it into a joke, but David didn't. He simply sat down and resumed listening to the speaker on stage, heart steady. For all their wealth, they didn't understand what that smile had meant. It wasn't validation, it wasn't flirtation, it was an acknowledgement. And sometimes, for someone who spent years unseen, that can feel like more than applause. He didn't know who Elena Sinclair truly was, not yet, but he knew this. In a room that had measured him by his suit, his speech, and the calluses on his hands, she had measured something else. And while the night was far from over, a new current had begun to move quietly beneath the surface. David wasn't sure what drew her to the balcony. Maybe she needed air, or maybe, though, he'd never presumed she was looking for him. The night had grown heavier, the ballroom hotter with perfume and ego, and he had wandered to the edge once more, glass of water in hand, seeking a moment of calm. The double doors to the balcony had been slightly ajar. Beyond them, the city stretched wide and unbothered, its lights glittering like a distant promise. David stood there quietly, shoulders relaxed, letting the wind cool the heat that had built up in his chest. He didn't hear her footsteps, but he sensed her presence. When he turned, Elena Sinclair was there, arms folded loosely in front of her, her expression unreadable in the dim light. For a moment neither of them spoke. It was the first silence all evening that didn't feel strained. Then she said, "I needed to breathe. It gets loud in there." David gave a short nod. "Yeah, it does." Her eyes studied him, not the way others had, not measuring but searching, like someone flipping through pages of a book they actually wanted to read. "You're Lily's father," she said softly, almost more of a statement than a question. He nodded again. "She's the best part of me." That made her smile, not a polite curl, but something closer to understanding. "I met her at the scholarship reception," Elena said. "She gave a speech about her dream to become an astrophysicist. Said you taught her to love the stars." David chuckled under his breath. "I used to point them out through the sunroof of our truck on clear nights. Told her every one of them had a story." Elena stepped closer to the railing. "And you gave her a story big enough to reach them." They stood there, Two very different lives brushing against one another beneath the same sky. She didn't ask about his job, his past, or the obvious difference in their worlds. Instead, they spoke about their children, about the small things that carried the greatest weight. He learned she had never married, had built her company from the ground up after losing both parents young. She spoke with ease, but not without emotion. And David, for the first time that night, felt seen not as an outsider, but as an equal. There was no flirtation in their words, just the truth. And something stronger: respect. A connection not forged in status or ambition, but in the quiet bond of two people who had carried burdens and somehow still stood tall. The stars above them didn't blink any brighter. But for David, something inside had shifted, something he hadn't realized was waiting to move. They had barely been gone 10 minutes before the murmurs in the ballroom began to swell. Elena Sinclair was many things to many people: an icon, a benefactor, a mystery, but above all, she was untouchable. To see her disappear to the balcony, only to return later with David Harper at her side, was a disruption the guests didn't know how to process. And so, they did what the powerful often do when faced with something unfamiliar. They gossiped. It started at table 5, where a socialite whispered sharply behind her wineglass, "Maybe she thinks he's a project." From there it spread, morphing with each retelling. "He must have said something tragic, pulled on her charity strings. Or maybe he's one of those inspirational types." Like a rags to riches angle, minus the riches. The most cutting voice came from a man with silver cufflinks who leaned in close to his companion and muttered, "She always did like lost causes." David felt it. He didn't hear the words exactly, but the shift in energy was impossible to miss. The stares lingered longer now. The laughter had changed tonequeter, but sharper, like knives wrapped in velvet. People spoke more cautiously around him, not because they respected him, but because they were suddenly curious. Curious about what Elena saw, curious about what they might have missed. At his table, the air had cooled. One woman leaned over and asked with false sweetness, "So, how do you know Miss Sinclair?" David looked her in the eye. "We talked about our kids." The simplicity of the answer left her blinking, momentarily disarmed. But her expression quickly tightened into a polite mask. It wasn't the answer she'd expected. There was no story to mock, no scandal to twist, just something they didn't understand: authenticity. Still, the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew more desperate, as if the room were trying to reassert its order. Because if someone like David could earn Elena's attention not through wealth or clout, but through something real, then maybe the entire hierarchy they had built their confidence on was not as secure as they thought. David said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence carried weight now. And even though some of those around him still looked at him like a mistake that hadn't been corrected, he remained steady. Because he knew what they didn't. He knew who he was. He knew who he loved. And he knew that for all their power, they were the ones shaken, not him. The room buzzed with anticipation as the charity auction began. Velvet catalogs were opened, paddles held loosely in well-manicured hands. Priceless art, exotic getaways, and exclusive dining experiences went under the gavel, each item a symbol of luxury, and each bid a declaration of status. Elena took her seat at the front, poised and unreadable, while David remained at his table, unnoticed for the first few minutes as the bidding began. Then the auctioneer introduced the final lot of the evening: special experience designed for the highest bidder, a private dinner with the Sinclair Foundation's founder, Ms. Elena Sinclair, at her estate. An evening of fine wine, conversation, and charity planning. A murmur of excitement swept through the room. This wasn't just a prize, it was a gateway. A few hands shot up quickly, bids rising from 10,000 to 50 in the blink of an eye. But before the auctioneer could call the next number, Elena raised her hand. The room stilled. She didn't raise her paddle. She stood. "I'd like to offer a change," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Tonight, I'd like to place the winning bid. Not for myself, but for someone else." She turned directly, unflinchingly, to David. "If he agrees, I would like to share that dinner with Mr. David Harper." The silence that followed was absolute. Forks paused mid-air. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the auctioneer seemed lost for words. David sat stunned, eyes locked on Elena's. She didn't look away. She didn't smile to soften the moment or add performance to her gesture. She simply waited, steady and calm, as the room tried to make sense of what had just happened. The evening had begun with him as an afterthought. Now, in the final moments, he was the centerpiece. And nothing would ever be the same again. At first, no one moved. The clinking of silverware, the rustling of silk gowns, the constant undercurrent of murmured chatter, all of it stopped. The silence wasn't respectful. I was stunned. No one had seen it coming. Not from Elena Sinclair, whose every move was usually calculated with precision, whose name alone carried enough weight to hush a room. But this was something else entirely. David sat frozen, not from fear, but disbelief. He hadn't misheard her. The words were still echoing in the air. If he agrees, I would like to share that dinner with Mr. David Harper. He looked across the room directly at Elena. She hadn't flinched. Her chin was lifted, her posture unshaken. She hadn't said it to cause a scene. She said it because she meant it, and that, somehow, made it even harder to process. Around him, chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably, trying to recover their composure. The expressions were varied confusion, curiosity, judgment, but none more piercing than those of the bidders who'd been prepared to throw down thousands for the chance to sit with her. Now they were left outbid by something they didn't understand: intention. Elena hadn't played the game. She had rewritten the rules. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly unsure whether to proceed. "Miss Sinclair, are you confirming your bid?" Elena didn't hesitate. "I am. 100,000, paid directly to the foundation, in Mr. Harper's name." A sharp inhale ran through the crowd. It wasn't just that she had chosen him. It was the amount. The declaration. The fact that she had turned a symbolic moment into something real and done it in front of everyone. David stood slowly, not out of drama, but necessity. He didn't want to hide behind the moment. If she had the courage to stand for him, then he could meet her with the same grace. He adjusted his jacket slightly, looked out at the sea of eyes now locked on him, and nodded. Not a showy nod, just a simple, quiet agreement. "If that's truly what you want," he said, his voice steady, "then I'd be honored." Gasps rippled across the room again, not because he'd accepted, but because of how he did it. Without apology, without shrinking, he didn't make himself smaller to fit the room's expectations. He simply stood as he was a father, a man, no more or less than that. And suddenly, the balance shifted. The same people who had mocked his presence now watched him with something bordering on awe. Because in that moment, it became clear: David Harper didn't need the gala to define him. He had redefined the evening by simply standing in his truth. As guests filed out of the ballroom, conversations buzzed louder than ever, but their tones had changed. Earlier in the evening, David had been reduced to a background character, curiosity in an ill-fitting suit. Now, he was the name on everyone's lips, the man the billionaire had chosen, the man who hadn't begged for attention, who hadn't played by any of their rules, and yet had somehow won the moment that everyone had assumed was reserved for someone else. But David didn't walk out with a swagger. He didn't soak in the sudden attention or feed off the stares. He walked slowly, deliberately, with a kind of calm that made people step aside without even realizing they were doing it. Elena followed beside him, silent for now, letting the evening settle. It wasn't until they reached the lobby that she finally spoke. "I hope I didn't put you on the spot," she said, voice low. David smiled gently. "You didn't. You just gave me a place I didn't think I'd ever be invited to." She studied him again, this time without the shield of glamour between them. "You carry yourself like someone who doesn't ask for anything." He shrugged. "Most of my life, I couldn't afford to." His answer wasn't bitter. It was honest. The kind of honesty that didn't need embellishment. Elena looked down at her heels, then back at him. "I admire that." They spoke for a while longer about Lily. about the scholarship program, about life outside of chandeliers and champagne. He told her stories of the garage, of the nights spent patching holes in his daughter's school uniforms, and the early mornings driving her across town so she wouldn't feel different from the others. And Elena listened, not politely, but attentively. No interruptions, no glances at her watch. She wasn't interested in the image of David Harper. She was interested in the man behind it. Back inside, people would try to make sense of it all. They'd question her motives, speculate endlessly, assign headlines to a moment that wasn't made for them. But Elena didn't care. And neither did David. Dignity, after all, wasn't something you could auction. It didn't come with a price tag or a spotlight. It came from standing firm when the world expected you to fold. And that's what David had done. By the end of the night, he hadn't just walked into a room that wasn't built for him, he'd walked out having changed it. The next morning, David woke early. The world felt the same in many ways. The hum of traffic outside, the smell of coffee brewing, the steady rhythm of the day beginning. But something in him had shifted. He sat at the small kitchen table, the one with the worn edge and a leg that needed propping up, and watched as Lily rushed in with her hair still damp from her shower, backpack half-zipped. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes widening. "Did you talk to her? Did it go okay?" she asked. David smiled. "Better than okay." He didn't say more, didn't need to. Lily saw something in his face that told her enough. She squealed, hugged him tightly, then ran off to grab her shoes. And in that moment, it all clicked. The gala, the judgment, the whispers, Elena's boldness. It had never really been about proving anything to the people in that room. It was about showing his daughter, and maybe even himself, that worth wasn't something the world gave you. It was something you chose to carry every day. Later that week, a letter arrived. Handwritten, elegant. It was from Elena. She thanked him for the conversation, for his honesty, and for reminding her why she started the foundation in the first place. She asked if he'd consider joining the advisory board, not for show, but to offer real insight into how the scholarships impacted families like his. She ended it with a simple line: "You changed more than just the evening. I'd like to see what else we can change together." David didn't answer right away. He read the letter 3 times, then placed it beside a picture of Lily on her first day of school. He smiled, quietly. Because for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something he had to fight his way into. It felt like something opening toward him, an invitation he'd earned, not through power, but through presence. And just like that, a new chapter began. Not with flashing lights or dramatic applause, but with something far more lasting. The quiet certainty that he and his daughter were finally seen.